Is the screen showing?
The screen is visible.
Okay. So I will start. Okay. So this is our first session, designing secure architectures on AWS. Well, I will talk a bit about myself. I'm Kata. I'm a third-year software engineering student. I also work as a cloud developer with a focus on operations and infrastructure as code in a small consulting company with a focus on AWS and cloud services. I previously pursued an English literature and a linguistics degree, but I changed careers path 3 years ago. And I also have spoken at Chile's and Peru AWS Community Day. And I am a big A.R. Rahman fan. I can't speak Hindi or Tamil, but I love his songs. I have a playlist there. So yeah, I also have a picture in Peru with my friend. She's another cloud captain. She lives in Chile, but she's from Venezuela. That was a workshop we did. Okay, so today's agenda will be having an introduction, the context setting. Then we will go through some relevant points for the exam. So design secure access to AWS resources and design secure workload, and also determine appropriate data security controls, and also Q&A questions and answers part. Okay, so the introduction. Okay, so every session will be corresponding to one of the exam domains. This session is about secure architectures, and it is 30% of the exam. Because this is security, I will not be doing hands-on exercises this session, because so many of the contents in security require an account setup or are theoretical concepts like encryption, for example. But in other sessions, I will show you hands-on content. The second session will be about resilient architectures, then high-performing architectures, and then cost-optimized architectures, which is the domain with the less percentage. But in the last session, I will also give you my handwritten notes so you can study resources, tips for the exam, what schedule I did, how I prepared everything. So it will be a session with tips, but also with a theoretical part. Oh, this is in Spanish, sorry, but it is an overview of the exam structure. So the format is very similar as a cloud practitioner, but the answers and the context of the question is longer. Usually we have a business use case and we have to determine, for example, in the last domain, what service is the cheapest, or what service will fit the use case. And well, I always recommend to give the certification in a not give it online, so give it at a testing center, and this removes so much stress. You don't have to worry about your internet connection going down, or the power grid going out. There are 65 questions, I think. And also, I think these minutes are wrong because this is for cloud practitioner. But if English is not your first language, so it isn't mine, they give you 30 extra minutes if you say that English is not your first language, but give the test in English. This is a very, it's a very good perk. because you can read the questions more calmly, and also reduces a lot of stress. I think one of the best tips I can give you for the exam is don't stress over it. Go with tranquility, go with the mentality you're going to pass it, because even if you know the contents, if you are stressed or if you are if you go with a mindset of I'm going to fail, it will be more difficult. Okay, so going into the contents, well, I will talk about the shared responsibility model. This is it's not exactly the same, but it is very similar for all cloud computing providers. So there, AWS is in charge of the security of the cloud. What does this mean? Well, for example, EC2 machines are in servers. These servers are in AWS data centers, and AWS is in charge of the security. So they have fences, they have security guards, cameras, controls to enter, etc. So AWS is responsible for the infrastructure, for the servers not going down, for having redundancy in electricity, for example. So if there is a power grid failure, the data centers will not shut down. Also, for example, depending if the service is in software as a service or platform as a service, they also patch the OS. For example, they do all the networking configurations, and it depends if the service is infrastructure service, platform service, etc. But the customer is always in charge of the identity and access management. So if I have an employee in my company and he is a trainee, I will not give him admin access to everything. Why? Because if he, for example, leaks a credential, then my whole company will go down. So for a trainee, I will give him only the appropriate permissions. Also, the resource configuration, you must connect the services properly, and also the customer function code and libraries. Depending on the service, as I said, you must configure the libraries, you must download AWS CLI, etc. And the customer is responsible for the security of the data in the cloud. We must protect our data, but AWS must protect the physical infrastructure. Okay. So the first topic is design secure access to AWS resources. Okay, we will talk about users, groups, IAM rules, and policies. So a user is a user, of course, and a user can be part of a group. A group can be, for example, the developer group. Why do we a developer group, a tester group, a DevOps group, for example? Why do we create groups? Well, users can have policies attached. These policies determine which actions and services can the user access. So for example, we could have a developer's policy in which users can create EC2 instances, can create buckets, and can read and put objects in the bucket. But assigning permission for every user individually is very tedious and takes a lot of time. And also, if then we want to modify the permissions, we will have to modify them one by one. So for this, we create groups, and the rules are applied to each user in the group. And for example, for the tester group here, the testers may not need to create instances or buckets. They, for example, can make audits on the S3 bucket, and for this, they only need read access. So we can implement the principle of least privilege with groups. Another thing which is a best practice and necessary for AWS security, are roles. Roles are temporary and they are assumed. So, for example, a user can assume a role, and this role is not tied to a person. And also, roles can be assigned to some resources. So, for example, imagine I have a ECS container, and I want to access a bucket. Sorry for giving the bucket and ECS and EC2 examples, but they are the most easy. So a container wants to access a bucket. The most secure thing to do is not to have the credentials, don't have the full permission all the time. The instance can assume the role when it wants to put an object in the bucket or to retrieve an object in the bucket. And this role is temporary, so we don't have the risk of having this open connection every time. And the same is for users. You can give a temporary roles to users and limit when they can access some resources. And this is what I talked about. This is temporary, so the role has a trust policy. What is a trust policy? The role has trusted entities, and a trusted entity can be the user or the resource or AWS service. So in the trust policy, it says this user can assume this role. And the temporary credentials, when the user assumes the role, the user or the resource assumes the role, temporary security credentials are created, and then the permissions are given temporarily to that user. This is something I talked about, the principle of least privilege. This is so important, not only for AWS or the cloud. It is very important for all software engineering. So we don't have to give ample permissions. We have to give granular permissions to do the specific actions we want to do. Why? This is not only because we don't trust our employees, but not necessarily that. It can be that the account, for example, can be hacked. And if that account is hacked, but it only has access to a bucket in particular, that will not be very damaging. But if every user has admin permissions, it can be fatal, and it can be really damaging for the company or the project. And here I have two examples, one of incorrect permissions and one of good practices. So the first permission allows all actions on all buckets and all its objects. And this means any action. It can, for example, mean we can delete the bucket. So this is not good at all. And a good practice would be to give specific action and permissions. So, for example, get object and list bucket in two resources, in one resource, sorry, in a bucket called my secure bucket. And the slash asterisk means the objects inside the bucket. So this principle says get object and list bucket permissions are allowed on this bucket and its objects. So I have a little question that you can answer in the chat. It is which of the following should the solutions architect implement to follow the standard security advice of granting least privilege? So A, attach the power user access, AWS manage policy to the IAM users, attach the administrator access, AWS manage policy to IAM users, create a new IAM role, and attach the system administrator AWS managed policy to it, and assign the IAM role to the IAM users, and create a new IAM role and attach the administrator access AWS managed policy to it. Assign the IAM role to the IAM users. I will log in my cell phone so I can see the chat. And not interrupt the okay. No, I will check the chat here. See? Okay, let's see. Let's see because yes, the correct answer is C. Why is it C? So having a role is better than having a user have permanent access. So A and B are discarded, and between C and D, so system administrator can mean, for example, having administrator access to EC2 instances, but not necessarily all resources in the account. An administrator access is having is being an administrator on AWS resources. So alternative C is the better option. Another way we can access our AWS accounts is through federated access. So identities can also be federated. So for example, in my company, I log in with my Outlook email through to my AWS account. And this can be done with Cognito. And for example, I will explain more about Cognito later. But this means that we can log into AWS with identities in another directory. And this is also done through a token. So in the real world, for example, in my company, I work with many clients, and I have to access their AWS accounts. And when I log in, I see all the clients' accounts. So you can create an organization, an AWS organization, and invite existing accounts into the organization. And they are organized with organizational units. So for example, production, development, security, or also the client name account. And you can apply service control policies. For example, to disable certain services you don't want anyone to use. So in this example, EC2 is not available for the accounts in the organizational unit. And you can also restrict IAM actions, say, I only want my resources to be in this AWS region, or prevent users in a group to create resources. So to make it more clear, this is an AWS organization example. So the organization management account, there must always be a root account that is always present, but then you can create other organizational units. And each organizational unit has a different accounts, and these accounts can be assumed as well as roles. So the infrastructure team will not have to access the same resources as the security team. And this is why the accounts are separate and they have different permissions. And as I said, if you remember, I said that roles can be assumed by a resource or an account. And there are IAM policies for IAM identities and resource-based policies. And the policies, as I said, are permissions that are assigned to an account or a resource. So IAM policies are attached to IAM identities, so users, groups, roles, and resource-based policies are attached to resources like S3 buckets, Lambda functions. And a common use for IAM policies is to define what users, what actions a user or role can perform. And also with resource-based policies, for example, in an S3 bucket, you can make a policy in which all internet users can access, irrespective if they have an AWS account or not. In other sessions, I will show you more about S3 buckets. It's very important. And a very common starting project for AWS is to make a static website with S3 and CloudFront. And in that example, you allow access to the bucket for non-AWS users. So that is an example of a resource-based policy. And also some best practices for IAM security. We must never use the root user for daily operations. The root user is the first user we create, and it cannot not be limited. The permissions for it cannot be limited. So it can do anything in the account. And this is the equivalent of the management account that is on top in that diagram. Another good practice is to enforce multi-factor authentication on all users. And this is because if our credentials get stolen, we will have another verification step. So the adversary cannot use our accounts. Also follow the principle of least privilege in every step of development and infrastructure. Use roles for apps and services. Also, federate access is very recommended because when we federate and a user is linked to a real identity, because, for example, Google or Microsoft accounts, they usually ask us for our telephone number, address, etc. So those accounts are more, they have more information, and they have usually more restrictive registration registration steps. And also, if an organization uses a mail provider, for example, and then connects it with AWS login, it is so much easier and faster. Also, separate environments using accounts and apply service service control policies. And I think I will show you in a later course, but using CloudTrail and IAM Access Analyzer. CloudTrail is a service which is very important for this exam, and it logs all the API calls we make to AWS resources and services. So, for example, every time someone creates a container or modifies a policy, it will be logged through CloudTrail, and then it can be audited, and we can see which person did that action. This is very important when debugging, but also if we have a security incident or unusual activity, and we can check if anything wrong is happening and who did it, which account did it, where this API call was from, etc. And IAM Access Analyzer, it checks, I don't remember, I have some notes here. these are my handwritten notes, but I think it has to do with IAM account access and which person did that also. So design secure workloads and applications. So this is not exactly in this domain of the exam, but I think it's really important to talk about AWS regions and availability zones. So there are many AWS regions in the world. I know in India there are two regions, one in Mumbai and other in I don't remember the other city, but there are two. And also less than a month ago, here in Chile, there was announced the new AWS region for South America. So we are the second country in the South America region. And this region will be implemented next year, so 2026. And each region consists in 3 or more availability zones. And one availability zone is a collection of 3 or more data centers. And these data centers are connected, but they are not that close together. Why? Because regions and availability zones must be resilient to, for example, climate disasters or attacks. So they are separate, but they are connected through, I think, very through very fast cables and connectivity. And the locations, we know more or less where they are, but the exact location is not disclosed, so it is secret. And they have a lot of security. And if an availability zone fails, then we can connect to another availability zone, and data is replicated sometimes through the availability zone. So if an availability zone fails, we can retrieve the data from other availability zones. And if a region fails, well, that is more difficult. I don't think a whole region has failed in AWS, but there are also contingency plans through that for that. But the issue there is that data transfer between regions costs money. So having an application that is in multiple AWS regions will be costlier than to have it in multiple availability zones, and having it in only one availability zone is cheaper. But the downside is that you can have data loss or service interruption. So VPCs are one of the foundations of AWS. I think they must be one of the most important concepts alongside S3 buckets, IAM, and databases. So a VPC is AC resilient. What does this mean? If an AC fails, then another AC will take the load. But also we can divide the VPC into different subnets. So we can have a subnet in different availability zones, and then we have our application is more available. And what does this mean? In case of failure, it will withstand failure, but also if the user is closer to a particular availability zone, it will be faster. And one subnet equals one availability zone or more, but one availability zone can have zero subnets. So this means that we can have only one subnet, basically. And within a VPC, there are components. So there is a VPC router. The VPC router routes traffic between subnets. And then there is a route table. And this, oh, I got a typo there. But the route table has rules that determine where the network traffic is directed. If this is not clear, in the next slide, I will show you an example. The Internet Gateway is region resilient and moderates the traffic between the VPC and the public internet. Why is that? Because we can have VPCs that don't have internet access to the public internet. You may ask, well, if we don't have access to the public internet, how will we connect with other AWS services? We will see that later, but it is possible. Also, network access control lists. So these are stateless, and they are on the subnet level. They control which data gets in and out and who can access the subnet. Stateless mean that if we authorize the entry of the data, we also have to authorize if we authorize inbound data, we also have to authorize outbound data. So we have to specify inbound and outbound access. So we have to be careful with that. And also we have security groups, which are stateful. This means if we authorize inbound access, outbound access is automatically assigned to that IP. And it is on the instance level. So, here it is. Okay, so say a security group only allows rules. So there is no deny, ANACL or network control list. We have both allow and deny rules because of what I said, inbound and outbound access. And security group by default denies all traffic unless an IP is allowed. And the network access control list is the opposite. So it allows all inbound and outbound traffic unless changed. And why is that? Because it is stateless. It would be very tedious to allow all traffic. So this is why it allows all traffic by default. And well, the return traffic must be explicitly allowed in NACLs, and in security group, the return traffic is automatically allowed. So in a security group, if someone gets in, they can get out, but in a network access control list, this is not necessarily the case. Also, talking about a connection to the public internet, we have a NAT instance and NAT gateway. So NAT means network address translation. Networking is not my forte, but I will show you resources later which are really great for understanding how networking works, how IP address can be divided, how subnets can be divided, how DNS works. This is a free course that I will show later. But there are two. So what does NAT do? NAT translates the IPs we have in our VPC. So I don't know if you have probably done projects on your PC. And for example, when I run Node.js projects, they usually, they use my localhost address. And localhost is, a specific IP address, but it's the same for everyone. So how can I access another person's computer or server if the local host address is the same? Well, we have a network address translation component, which translates our internal IP addresses to unique IP addresses which can be accessed for anywhere on the internet. So this translates our internal addresses for somebody else to access or to have a specific IP address for the public internet. And in AWS, there are two ways to do this NAT address translation, but one is not deprecated, but it is not that recommended. It's still in the exam. And the other one is much easier, but sometimes costlier. So the first one is a NAT instance. The NAT instance is, in reality, it is an EC2 instance with certain security group rules and network access control lists. And this must be launched in a public subnet. And this NAT instance does the work that I said. There are AMIs, so images you can download for NAT instances. But the recommended way for doing this is to have a NAT gateway. Why? Because this gateway is managed by AWS, so you don't have to worry about the infrastructure. You just set it up, and then don't worry about it. But you pay per hour of usage and traffic, and it requires an internet gateway. And the traffic goes from the private subnet to the NAT gateway to the internet gateway. Why? Because first we must translate our internal addresses. Well, here we talk about the public subnet. So what is a public subnet? How is it different from a private subnet? So in reality, the only difference between a private subnet and a public subnet is that the private subnet doesn't have access, direct access to the internet. So let me check my notes. Okay. So the public subnet is associated with a route table, which routes traffic to the internet. And here we can have Bastion host, application load balancers, NAT gateway, etc. And these are the entry points for our infrastructure. But then in the private subnet, we place the resources like instances or databases, which we don't want to be accessible through the public internet without any control. So we allow outbound traffic. So we allow for example, databases. We can send data, but we cannot allow data to get in from the public internet. And these are for workloads that shouldn't be exposed to the general public or which have sensitive information. And with this segmentation in public and private subnets, we can put in practice the principle of least exposure. So isolating sensitive components. And here I will show you about the route table. So the private subnet, the public subnet says that all traffic 0.0.0.0 means all IP addresses. So the target of all IP addresses will be the internet gateway. But the destination, the other IP has a local target. And you can see that the route table in the private subnet does not have the internet gateway referred. So that is the difference between a public and a private subnet. It has to do with the route table. Here are some other security services. There are many security services in AWS. I will not be able to show you all the services because there are many. I will share you some links later, as I said. but I want to talk to you about what I consider to be important security services. So AWS Shield is a service that helps you protect your applications from DDoS attacks. DDoS means a distributed denial of service. So these are many requests from many computers at the same time that saturate your servers and your application. DDoS attacks can be malicious or can even be unintended. For example, in my country, we love going to concerts, um, and we have to buy the tickets always via the internet. So people are lining up in their computers and they enter the website at the same time. And if the server is small or doesn't have good resiliency, it will go down because the requests are so much that they overwhelm the server. This is a DDoS attack, but which is unintended. But DDoS attacks can also be um, be done with malicious intent. So uh, with DDoS attacks, we can have a botnet, so a collection of zombie computers or computers with bots that overwhelm a specific server and shut the service down. This has happened with some famous forums, for example. Uh, so this service protects us from these DDoS attacks. For example, they can have a restriction on how many requests a single IP can make, and also well, there are in the advanced AWS Shield, you can also have a direct contact with support, and they can help you manage this. So it is crucial for big enterprises to so their servers don't get overwhelmed. And another important service is Web Application Firewall. So this firewall monitors HTTP and HTTPS requests to an application load balancer or a CloudFront distribution, and they have rules that block. So they can block SQL injection attacks. They can block cross-site scripting attacks, very long query strings, etc. Okay, so this is a example of a web application firewall rule. So in the right, sorry, there are many rules. There are 9 rules, and these rules are executed. The rules with the lowest number are executed first. And here we have in the highlighted rule, it is an embargoed countries rule. So what is an embargoed country? A government, for example, might want to block visitors from some countries, from some adversarial countries. So we can block requests from people from a specific country with this rule. And how does it work? Well, there is legitimate traffic from the users that is allowed. There are attackers that use SQL injections, cross-site scripting attacks, etc., and those are blocked by rules, for example, 7, 8, 6, etc. And then we have the user traffic from sanctioned countries, which can be countries we are at war with, for example. And it is not done here, but in this example, there is a JSON file with all the countries that are embargoed. And based on this JSON file, requests from those countries are denied automatically. So as you can see, this is very, very important. And also the SQL injection rule. I don't know if you know about this specific attack, but if the form fields in a website are not protected or they are not properly validated, we can make queries to the database. So a common way this attack works is if someone tries to get the credentials of the database or passwords using queries, and this WAF rule that is already made by AWS, you don't have to make it yourself, you just apply it, can protect automatically against these kinds of attack. Other services which are important are Secrets Manager and Cognito. Cognito is a word is a world in itself. It is very, very important, and maybe we will see it also in another session. I can make a hands-on with Cognito, but okay, let's talk about Secrets Manager. So we can store secrets such as password, API keys, and then reference this in our application code instead of hard coding. So we reference the secret ID, but not the password itself or the API key itself. And we can also rotate secrets. So we can say, I want this secret to change after 30 days. This is good because if the credentials get leaked, they can expire too. So we can change the secrets dynamically. This is very useful I use it every day almost with CloudFormation. When I make infrastructure with infrastructure as code, I for example, if I create a EC2 instance and a database, and I want the EC2 instance to connect to the database, I can reference the user and the password as a secret, and then deploy this template and deploy this infrastructure, but the actual password is never referenced in the template code. So if this template gets leaked, nothing will happen because the secret is in Secrets Manager. Then Cognito. Cognito is used for integrating a easy login to our application. So this is the Cognito standard login. We can customize it. But for example, you can make a Node.js application and then integrate Cognito, and then your users can register with their social media accounts or their email. And there are two flavors of Cognito. So Cognito user pools. Cognito user pools only apps sign up and sign into your apps, but then with Cognito identity pool, you can have these identities use temporary and control access to other services in your account. So Cognito user pool is for login, and with identity pools, you can link them with federated identities. For example, well, I talked about earlier about VPCs that don't have an internet gateway, right? Or which don't have public internet access. We can connect with AWS services without trespassing the public internet. This is more secure, but it is also sometimes costlier. So we can use VPC endpoints. I will talk about a project I did at my job in which we use interface endpoints or gateway endpoints. I had to do a Lambda which retrieved, this Lambda was in a VPC, and this Lambda had to retrieve, was a CRUD Lambda for a database. And we decided that we don't want this to traverse the public internet because an internet gateway or a NAT gateway is expensive. So we used an interface endpoint. and we accessed the RDS database directly. And what is the difference between gateway endpoints and interface endpoints? So basically, gateway endpoints are only for S3 and DynamoDB, but they are free. Okay, but interface endpoints are for every other service in AWS, but it has a cost. So here I have an example with an interface and a gateway endpoint. So the interface endpoint accesses CloudWatch. This interface endpoint is associated with an ENI. An ENI is an elastic network interface. So it is, think of it as a network card. So all these instances, EC2 instances, which are in private subnets, they can access CloudWatch via this VPC endpoint and don't traverse the public internet. So they go directly through AWS servers. And the other example is a gateway endpoint. And this gateway endpoint accesses, well, DynamoDB and S3. With every service you want to set up needs to have its own endpoint. So one endpoint equals one service. So you cannot have one endpoint for both S3 and DynamoDB. You must have two endpoints, one endpoint, sorry, for every service. And interface endpoints can sometimes be cheaper than having a NAT gateway, but it depends on how much endpoints there are. Sometimes if you must access a lot of services, it is cheaper to set up a NAT gateway, and you can see that we can see that then in the cost session actually, if you want. And I can show you how to use the official AWS calculator. I think it is called. I use it for my job as well. So we talked about connecting with AWS servers, but we can go one step beyond that, and we can connect directly to the AWS data centers with Direct Connect. So Direct Connect is a private low latency connectivity to your AWS resources, and it lets you bypass the internet altogether. And well, what does this mean? This means that you have from your, for example, from your own premise. So you have a server in your office, for example, or in your own data center, and if you use Direct Connect, this means that your server is connected directly via a cable to an AWS data center. So this can be very costly, but it is very fast, and it is used by big companies, etc. And but you have to you have to pay for the cable installation and everything. And this also is, but it is secure, it is private, and you can also have security measures in top of it. So we talked about private subnets previously and EC2 instances. And as a best practice, we should not expose EC2 instances directly to the internet. So we must have them in our private subnet. So and we can make something we can use something called Bastion host. A Bastion host is an EC2 instance which only has one purpose, and that purpose is to control the traffic to an EC2 instance. And the way we do this is we put a Bastion host in the public subnet, so it can be used by the whole internet. But then in the rules, we only said that certain IPs, for example, can enter. So in my job, we have a client that does have a Bastion instance, and this Bastion instance is used to enter EC2 instances and also RDS instances. And in the Bastion host, there is a list with the IPs. For example, from the office, there is also the IP from my house because I work remotely. And this means that if my IP changes, I cannot SSH into the instance. So this is a way to enter the instance, and you must enter with your SSH key and everything, but it does the control this way. And you can add IAM controls and security group rules, as I say. So my IP is in the security group because I can enter, but another IP cannot enter. Okay. Determine appropriate data security controls. Okay, so we will see server-side encryption, client-side encryption, which are different, and also different types of server-side encryption. So the first one is server-side encryption at flight. What does at flight mean? So this is data that is traveling from a client to a server. Okay, it is data that is traversing the internet. I don't know. Well, you probably know because you must be very smart if you are in the club and also studying a technical career. But I don't know if you have noticed, for example, this this log here. So this means that this traffic is encrypted at flight. And this has to do with a special certificates called TLS and SSL certificates. And this encrypts HTTP to HTTPS. What is the difference between HTTP and HTTPS? Well, HTTP is not secure, so websites which don't have that lock icon there are HTTP. And HTTPS, the S in HTTPS stands for secure. So why is HTTP not secure? Well, because we don't know if we cannot assure that the data has not been meddled with in the travel to the client to the HTTP to the server. I will see my notes because, as I said, networking is not my forte, but okay. Okay, so by using TLS, you can prevent attackers from reading your data or modifying your data at transit. And this is essential for protecting sensitive information and meeting compliance requirements. And why do we talk about encryption in HTTPS? Well, because the data before being sent to the server is encrypted, and then it is decrypted by the server. So before it reaches the server, the data is encrypted and it cannot be read. And only when it reaches the server is the data decrypted. With HTTP, this doesn't happen, okay? And the other type of server-side encryption is server-side encryption at rest. So this is for data stored in the server. So this is data that is not traveling, okay? And this protects stored data, so data that is on the disk, in databases, in instances, etc. And it encrypts after data is written and decrypts it before reading. And it uses the industry standard AAS 256 I'm not really good with real numbers, sorry. And for encryption at rest, AWS offers in S3 we can configure this. In EBS we can encrypt the volumes. EBS are volumes attached to EC2. We'll see that in another session. We can also encrypt our databases and KMS keys. We will see that later, but they are also encrypted. And I didn't say that, but in encryption at flight, it is common in API calls. So in S3 data transfers, we can encrypt our data. In load balancer, also in API gateway. And I will later show you a service which helps us with generating these TLS SSL certificates. And client-side encryption. Okay, for some industries, I think, for example, the very sensitive industries, like banking industry, they have different encryption requirements, and the data cannot be stored in plain text in AWS. So we have client-side encryption. And what does this mean? Before we upload the data to the cloud, we encrypt it in our own computer, and we generate the key, and we own the key. And we must manage the keys and logic. With server-side encryption, AWS can take care of it. But here we have to take care of the whole process. And well, the benefit is AWS never sees the unencrypted data. But the downside is really big. Why? Because if you lose the encryption key, you lose the data. So if this key gets deleted, you will never ever be able to retrieve the data which is encrypted. This is mandatory for some industries, but I have never had to deal with client-side encryption because I don't work with sensitive industries. But this is something to have in mind for the exam. Okay, if there is a question about client must encrypt their data before uploading the document to the AWS because of compliance or regulatory uh, practices, well, it is client-side encryption, okay? And there are SDKs to encrypt your data in your site, okay, before storing it on the service and the server. Sorry. This is a course I recommend a lot. It is not only about encryption, it is about networking fundamentals, how IP addresses are assigned, how does the internet work actually, how hashing works, how DNS works, how top-level domain works. So the authority of the domain, how do, for example, .com addresses get assigned. And this course is completely free. I will share it in the last slides. I have a GitHub repo with many free links and resources you can access, so you can in now. But this course is so great because it finally made networking click for me. I don't know, it was truly great, and this guy Adrian Cantrell, he explains this so well. Please check it out. It is free. It is on YouTube too. And Adrian Cantrell also has a solutions architect course, which is the one I did to prepare for the exam. And he truly explains very well. The course is made for beginners. So it explains everything for a beginner. to pass the exam. It is truly great, and I recommend it a lot. If you want to see how encryption works with pretty diagrams and everything. And as I said, well, I talked to you about SSL certificates. Well, the service that manages SSL certificates is AWS Certificate Manager, so ACM, and it is a managed service. I don't know if I explained before, but a managed service is a service in which you don't administer the infrastructure. So this is a managed service to provision, manage, and deploy SSL TLS certificates. It enables HTTPS on Elastic Load Balancers and application load balancers, CloudFront, and API Gateway. So some features, this service is free. So a feature is 3 public SSL certificates, and they are auto-renewed for use with supported AWS services. If you have set up a server in your computer before, I have done so, and you can install bots that renew your certificate. So I think one is called Let's Encrypt, for example. But you have to set this up, and you have to renew it with ACM. That is not necessary. And you can also set up this certificate for things that are not in servers. For example, for an S3 bucket which is associated with a CloudFront distribution. You can create internal TLS certificates. There is no need for manual intervention for supported integrations. And well, the integrations I already told you, ELB, ALB, CloudFront, API Gateway, CloudFormation, etc. And KMS, I think I talked about KMS earlier, but I don't know. So KMS can create keys for you and lets you track, rotate, and delete the keys. So when I talked about server-side encryption, for example, you can create your keys for encryption and store them in KMS. And this whole process of encryption, decryption, and here as well, is automatically made with KMS. And you can integrate KMS with CloudTrail, and which is the benefit of this? It records all the key-related events. So every time something is encrypted or decrypted, it is logged in CloudTrail. And this is an example. So an object is, I assume, encrypted, and then decrypted in the S3 bucket, and these actions are stored in CloudTrail. And then with Amazon Athena, which is a service in which we can query documents and objects, we can query the CloudTrail uses of KMS in an account, for example. Another thing, I repeated one more time, but we will see S3 and EC2 in depth in the next sessions. But an important thing to keep in mind for S3 are the bucket policies. So an S3 bucket policy is a resource policy, but which is specific for an S3 bucket. And with these policies, we can have fine-grained access control at the bucket level. We can also attach these permissions. All the permissions in AWS are written as a JSON document, and they are attached to S3 buckets. And these policies define who, so the principal, can do what action, on which resources, under which conditions. And in this policy example, it is called deny unencrypted object uploads. So, and the effect is deny. So this will deny all users or resources which put objects in a bucket called my secure bucket, which don't have server-side encryption. Okay, so what does this mean? If we try to put an object that is not encrypted with AES 256, the upload will be denied. This is a bucket policy. You can also have bucket policies, for example, to deny internet access to your bucket, or as we have seen earlier, that only some users can access, some users can have read access and other users can have write access. Well, here is another important thing for some industries. So Amazon Macy is a service that automatically discovers and classifies personally identifiable information. This PII depends on every country. Each country has different regulations and compliance standards. So, for example, in my country, we have a thing called root or run, and this is a number, a unique number for every person that lives in the country. And this is personally identifiable information. Another kind of information like this is, for example, your address or your full name in some circumstances. Also, in our ID card, we have a document number. This is also a PII because it is linked to a person. And I know you in India have a similar card. I know there is, I think, a card identifier number. So in this example that I show you, it is, we combine S3 with Macy. So this is an S3 bucket which has some information. And then Macy analyzes if we have a personally identifiable information. Then if a PII is found, we trigger an event bridge. Event bridge is a service which reacts to events. So we can make a rule in event bridge that says if a PII is detected by Macy, do something. And event bridge triggers this workflow which reviews the bucket tag. And if there is data with PII, it revokes public, it makes the bucket private with Lambda, and also sends a notification to our team. Why? Because if PII gets leaked, we can have fines by the government. We can have data leaks. So it is very important that we identify all the PII we have in our databases, in our buckets, etc. And well, Macy uses artificial intelligence also to identify which information is private. And you can also, I will search actually, because as I said, there is different standards by country. And I think in Macy, you can have different policies according to, okay, so for example, in India, driver license, only driver's license, wow. Here in Chile, I don't see if there is any data. Okay, so as I said, root, run, etc. So it has different, Macy has different different standards depending on the country, and you can't change this on AWS. At the start of the presentation, we also talked about regions and availability zones. And an important part of the exam, which I will brush off quickly in this section, but we will see in depth in another session, is backup and recovery strategies. So this is we backup our data so periodically, so we don't lose our data. For example, we can backup our database data once a day, for example. And then if someone deletes the database by accident, we can recover the copies. And there are also, and recovery means when backup is that to backup our data, but recovery is when an accident happens. It can be a disaster, for example, and the server gets down or the server gets deleted, etc. How can we restore that data? And we have different recovery options in AWS. So we have point in time restore. So this is brought to a specific time. This is what I said with the databases. If we make a backup of the database at, I don't know, Tuesdays at 2 p.m., then when we restore the data, it will be at that time. We can also have a cross-region backup. So we can have a backup in different regions to withstand disasters. So it protects from regional failures. The example is AWS Backup, which is a service we will see later, which has cross-region vaults. So it replicates your data automatically to another region. And because the data is already replicated, you can start that server more quickly if disaster hits. Also, there is automation with lifecycle policies. So it defines backup schedules and retention. An example would be a daily backup, which gets deleted after 30 days. If we have daily backups, there is no need to keep the backups all the time. We can delete them because we have more information. And the other recovery action is disaster recovery. It is part of a multi-region failover plan. And well, this is more advanced, but big companies have these kinds of plan, which happens if there is a war, for example, in this region, or there is a disruption, or for example, in my country, we have a lot of earthquakes. So which happens if an earthquake hits. And we have objectives. So RTO, I think, is recovery time objective and recovery point objective. I think so. Recovery time objective is how long will it take us to restore our data, to restore service, etc. And using AWS Backup, the service I described earlier, and also CloudFormation, which is the infrastructure as code service. With CloudFormation, you define AWS resources, for example, S3 buckets, IAM users, etc., in a JSON or YAML file. And this template can be uploaded, for example, to GitHub or anything, and you can recreate the same infrastructure in well, it is faster than doing it with the Visual Console. And some services in backup and recovery. So AWS backups are centralized backups across AWS services. So for example, I may have backups in my database, but also in EBS, so my storage for my EC2 instance. And all these backups are in AWS Backup. They are centralized, and I can see all the backups that I have in my account. Then we have RDS snapshots, so point in time DB recovery. We can do a snapshot at any time, and the snapshot will save all the data we have at that moment. Then Amazon S3 versioning. With S3, we can have multiple versions of an object. So we can have, for example, a document version 1, version 2, etc. And we can recover deleted or overwritten objects with versioning. And then with EBS snapshots, we have a block level backup of volumes, so we have a copy of the whole volume data. Well, I think I was too fast, maybe. I can answer your questions or the things you any question you have or any doubts. But I will share you my Linktree link in the chat. Here is my social media and also the GitHub repo I promised you. So here is the repo. There is the course I talked to you about, technical fundamentals. There is also a solutions architect associate course, completely free on YouTube, which is approximately 50 hours. And also useful websites which you can use to study. And there are also some paid resources. I have used all these resources, so I can attest to their quality. And I will put the link in the chat, okay? Okay, so if you have any questions, any comments, anything, you can talk now or you can send me a message on LinkedIn, and I will take your comments. Okay. Thank you very much for listening and everything.
Yeah, Kathleen, that was really an inspiring session. I really appreciate you, like you share your time and your insights on the secure cloud architectures. It was truly inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, guys,
I'm so, yeah.
Any questions you can ask her?
If you have questions and they appear to you later, you can send me a message on LinkedIn. I'm happy to respond and everything. Or if you want to see a topic addressed on later sessions. Well, okay. Also, how long do you think we need to prepare for the exams? Okay, I have this is my, oh no, but this is the one for this year. I cleared the exam this summer here. Summer for us is in February, January. I think in January I cleared it. And I studied for 3 months, I think, but because I wanted to be really, really prepared, and also because I work part-time and I study. But I think 3-4 months is good for you, but it also depends if you have a cloud practitioner or if you have practical experience with AWS. If you don't have any practical experience, it will take longer because this exam is designed for you to answer with practical experience. So not only learning the theory, but also doing things in doing AWS projects and everything. If you don't have any experience with practical projects, don't worry, because in the link I sent you, I put a YouTube playlist, which is from an account which has beginner-friendly projects. I will also send it in the chat, okay? And you can do projects from there. But I would say 3 months. Also depends on how much you study. What I did to know I was prepared, I did a course, and then when I finished that course, I used some practice exams, and I scored well. I failed at the tests at first, but I checked which services I was less good on. And that way you can check if you know the contents or not. but I was not sure actually, and I changed the exam date many times, like 2 times. You can also do that. You can schedule your exam, and if you don't feel prepared, you can change the date. So that is good. Look here, I'm studying for another certification, developer associate, and here everything in red is the time I failed that test. So don't feel discouraged if you don't know something at the start, okay? That would be my advice. And also follow my links. And you can also search in Reddit how much people studied. I use Reddit a lot. And I actually had an area of the exam I was really bad at. And I guess, I am bad at, I think I was at building resilient architectures, and they shared resources with me for free. So you can do that as well. And you can ask on Reddit, and community is really nice there in AWS certification subreddit. Also, well, I will these policies. Okay, thank you. Me persuade your Raymond to master the consequences. Yes, we can. This session was theoretical, but because in the next sessions I will show you how to do things on S3 buckets, for example, and then we will write some policies. So we will cover that contents there, because talking about security just in a vacuum without any resources is kind of difficult. But yeah, I will show you hands-on exercises in the later sessions. So don't worry, okay? Some people go on Reddit and do it in a day, so we cannot. Yes, but the thing with Reddit is you have to say, I'm a student, I don't work. How long do you think it will take? Because as I said, it all depends on previous experience. My boss, for example, he didn't study for the exam, but because he has worked so many years, he doesn't need to study, right? But if you're a student and you don't have hands-on cloud knowledge, you have to study, and that is okay. Well, thanks, ma'am. Thanks for sharing. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm really happy to have this session with you.
I think Diana has
If you,
some network issues on her side. She won't be able to talk.
oh,
Yeah.
that's sad.
With or a vote of thanks.
What? Sorry,
No, if you're done with the session, I'll end it with a vote of thanks. If you're done, like for today.
yes. I think we are done for now.
Guys, any other
So
questions you got? Like as we are at the end of a session today, on behalf of AWS Cloud Club, I extend my sincere thanks to all of you for being part of a day one of our bootcamp. A special thank you to Katrina for sharing her time and insights on cloud architectures. As we wrap up today, let's carry forward the knowledge we have gained and stay committed to build cloud in purpose. We'll see you all the day after tomorrow for day two. Until then, stay cloud driven, guys. Thank you. And thank you, Katrina, for your time. Just
bye. Thank you.
have a good day. Guys, you can leave the call.